There's a particular kind of cold that lives in London in November. Not the dramatic, cinematic cold of snowfall and frosted windows. Nothing so romantic. This is the damp kind, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your scarf and settles in there like it owns the place. Like it's been waiting for you specifically. I remember it that morning because I kept thinking, why am I even here? My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was standing on the pavement outside Buckingham Palace at 9:20 on a Tuesday, not even a weekend, with a paper coffee cup that had gone lukewarm in my hand, watching tourists shuffle into position along the railings like they were queuing for something at a supermarket. Orderly. Patient. Already on their phones. I'd been in London 3 days for work. A conference. The kind where you sit in a hotel ballroom under lights that are slightly too yellow and listen to people say things you already know. I had 2 hours before the morning session started and I decided on a whim, the way you sometimes do when you're in a foreign city and feeling guilty about not seeing anything, to walk down to the palace and catch whatever portion of the changing of the guard I could. I didn't expect much. Honestly, I'd seen it before. Years ago with my parents when I was 12. I remembered it as loud and slow and a bit confusing, all that marching and music without any real narrative to follow. The kind of spectacle that's more impressive in photographs than in person. But I was there. Coffee going cold. Nowhere else to be. The crowd was already thick near the main gates. Mostly tourists. A school group from somewhere. I could hear a language I couldn't place, something Eastern European maybe, the kids in matching yellow hibis vests and the teachers wearing that particular expression of controlled desperation that teachers on school trips always wear. A Japanese couple to my left were photographing everything with the kind of methodical thoroughness that made me feel slightly ashamed of my own passive observation. They photographed the gates. The guards. The sky. A pigeon on the railing. The pigeon seemed unbothered. I found a gap near the left side of the crowd, closer to the edge of the pavement than the center, which meant I was slightly further from the gate but had a cleaner sight line. The guards on duty, the ones standing in those boxes, the famous red-coated, bearskin-hatted ones, were doing what they always do. Standing. Staring at some fixed middle distance point that doesn't correspond to anything in the visible world. The stare is remarkable, if you look at it properly. It's not blank. It's not aggressive. It's somewhere between meditative and mechanical, like a man who has decided, completely and permanently, to be a monument for the next 2 hours. People were doing the thing tourists do. Walking up too close. Making faces. Trying to get them to blink. A teenager, maybe 15, lanky, wearing a hoodie that was nowhere near adequate for the temperature, stood directly in front of the guard's box and pulled an exaggerated grimace, posing for his friend's camera. The guard didn't flinch. Didn't breathe differently. Might as well have been painted. That's when I noticed the man. Not because he did anything loud or dramatic. The opposite, actually. He was doing so little, in a crowd that was constantly shuffling and repositioning and lifting phones above heads, that he created a kind of stillness around himself that my eye was drawn to in the same way you notice when a sound stops. He was old. Not vaguely old, not quite elderly old. Genuinely old. The kind of old that has weight to it, that you feel in your own body when you look at it. Maybe 80. Maybe older. He was standing, not leaning, which I noticed, because every other person his age in that crowd was using the railing about 10 feet from me, slightly toward the back of the gathered group, in a navy overcoat that had been expensive once, maybe 30 years ago, and was still being treated with the respect it had earned. The buttons were polished. The collar was straight. He had a cap on. A peaked cap, very specific, the kind that doesn't come from a department store. I didn't know what branch immediately, but there was a badge on it. A real one. He was watching the guards. Not taking photos. Not filming. Just watching. His hands were at his sides. He was very still. And there was something in his face, something I couldn't name from 10 feet away, something between recognition and endurance, that made me stop looking at the guards and start looking at him instead. I don't know how long I watched him before the woman next to him, his daughter, I assumed, from the physical similarity and the proprietary way she stood close to him without touching him, leaned slightly toward his ear and said something. He shook his head once. Didn't look at her. He kept watching. There are moments when you see something that your brain registers before you have language for it. Some primitive part of the processing that says, this matters, before the rational part has figured out why. That was one of those moments. I didn't know what was about to happen. I didn't know who this man was. I didn't even know yet that I was watching the beginning of something I would spend the next several years thinking about. I just knew, in the wordless way that sometimes precedes understanding, that something was about to shift. The changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace has been performed with variations, with interruptions for war, with adjustments for royal deaths and national emergencies for centuries. If you ask most people what it is, they'll describe it as pageantry. Tradition for tradition's sake. The British doing their British thing. That's not wrong. But it's not complete either. The men inside those uniforms, and they are almost all men, though that has been slowly changing, are not performers. They are working soldiers. The foot guards, the regiment responsible for the ceremonial protection of the palace, is a combat regiment. These are people who have served in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Northern Ireland. Who have done the things soldiers are trained to do and seen the things soldiers cannot unsee. The ceremony is real. The discipline is real. And the rules, the rigid, centuries-old rules about what a guard can and cannot do while on ceremonial duty, are real. A guard on sentry duty does not speak. Does not acknowledge the public. Does not break formation. Does not respond to provocation. Does not step out of position for any reason short of a direct security threat. Those are not suggestions. They exist because the ceremony depends on them. The seriousness, the gravity, the thing that makes it more than performance, it comes from the total commitment to form. The moment one soldier breaks character to react to a tourist, the whole thing deflates. It becomes a show. It loses the weight of what it actually is. Every soldier who stands the duty knows those rules from the first day of training. Which is why what happened next, I want you to understand, was not a small thing. The ceremony began properly around 9:30. The music came first, as always. That particular combination of brass and drum that you can feel in your sternum if you're standing close enough. The new guard marching up from Wellington Barracks, the old guard forming up at the gates. The officers calling movements in voices that carry without effort over the crowd noise. The whole beautiful, serious machinery of it clicking into motion. The crowd pressed forward. Phones went up. I stayed where I was. I kept one eye on the ceremony and one eye on the old man. He hadn't moved. His daughter had her hand half raised toward his elbow, not touching, hovering in that way people stand next to someone they're quietly worried about. He still had his eyes on the gates. The formation was moving now. The guard being relieved was marching past the long, precise stride, the rifles at the slope, the eyes forward. Close enough that if you leaned out you could have touched the nearest man's arm. That's when I saw the old man's chin lift. Just slightly. The way someone's chin lifts when they're controlling something. Keeping something in. And then, I saw what he was looking at. One of the guards in the marching formation had looked at him. Not a glance. Not an accidental eye contact. He had turned his head a minimal movement, maybe 3 degrees off the perfect forward line, and his eyes had found this one old man in a navy coat in a crowd of several hundred people. It lasted less than a second. The guard's eyes went forward again. The formation kept moving. But I had seen it. I know I had seen it. Because the old man had closed his eyes once, briefly, like a person receiving something, a blow or a grace, and sometimes those feel the same. His daughter had seen it too. Her hovering hand dropped. I looked at the man beside me, a broad-shouldered guy in a Canada Goose jacket who'd been filming everything, and he was already looking at me with the same expression I must have been wearing. Did you just, yeah? Neither of us said anything. We turned back. The exchange of sentries was underway. The formal part. The officer's commands, the precise rifle movements, the handing over of the palace keys, all of it executing with the kind of precision that takes years of practice to make look natural. I was watching the guard who had looked at the old man. He was back in perfect form. Absolutely back. Whatever had happened in that half second, he had closed it off and returned to the monument version of himself. Forward gaze, squared shoulders, the whole apparatus of ceremonial discipline re-engaged and locked. But I watched him. And, about 4 minutes into the formal exchange, during a pause in the movement while an officer gave a command, the guard did something that I want to describe very carefully because I want to get it exactly right. He didn't break formation. His feet stayed planted. His shoulders stayed square. His rifle stayed at position. But his eyes moved. Back to the old man. Deliberately and without any pretense of accident. And, this time, instead of moving away after a second, he held it. 2 seconds. 3. In a ceremony where a soldier's gaze is supposed to be fixed on nothing, on the ceremonial middle distance, on the performed permanence of the whole thing, this man held his gaze on one person in the crowd for a count that, in the context of those rules, was enormous. It was not insubordination. It wasn't defiance in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter and more serious than that. It was recognition. The old man stood there and received it. His spine was very straight. His hands were very still. And then, and I swear to you this happened, I've replayed it in my head more times than I can count, he brought his right hand up slowly, steady as a surgeon, and touched the peak of his cap. A salute. Not theatrical. Not performed for the crowd. The motion of a man who has made this gesture 10,000 times in his life, who doesn't need to think about the angle of his wrist or the height of his elbow. It came from somewhere deep and automatic. The guard's eyes were still on him. For 1 second, one completely still second, with the crowd noise and the music and the November cold all somehow paused around it, the guard held that gaze. Then, the officer barked a command. The formation moved. And the moment was over. Except it wasn't over. Because 30 seconds later, the woman standing to my left, a middle-aged American, Philadelphia accent, sensible shoes, said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Oh my God." And I turned and saw that she was crying. Not dramatically. Not the way people cry at movies with full preparation. The spontaneous kind, the kind your body does before you've given it permission, a single tear tracking down her cheek while she stared at the old man with her hand pressed to her collarbone. The teenage boy with the hoodie who'd been pulling faces at the guards 5 minutes ago was completely still. His friend had lowered the camera. They were both watching. The Japanese couple had stopped photographing. Even the school group, the yellow high-vis vests, the kids who'd been translating everything through the filter of adolescent disinterest, had gone quiet. There were maybe 200 people on that stretch of pavement. And every single one of them had seen it. The ceremony completed. The way it always does, cleanly, formally, the new sentries posted, the old guard dismissed, the officers exchanging whatever it is officers exchange at the end of these things. The music faded back toward Wellington Barracks. The crowd began the slow dissolution that crowds do when the main event is over, the gradual unclenching, the phone screens dropping, the small sounds of people stepping back and checking directions and deciding where to get breakfast. Normal. Except the area around the old man had not dissolved. There were maybe 15, 20 people still standing, closer than they'd been before, arranged in a loose orbit around him without quite acknowledging that that's what they were doing. The Philadelphia woman. The Canadian goose jacket man. The 2 teenagers. A few others. People who had seen what they'd seen and weren't quite ready to stop being near the person at the center of it. His daughter was talking to him now. Low voice, her hand finally on his arm. He was nodding, but he was still looking at the gate. I'm aware of how strange my next move was. I'm a fairly private person. I don't approach strangers. I don't do the thing where you walk up to someone at a significant moment and insert yourself into it. I find that kind of thing, the unsolicited sharing of someone else's emotional experience, vaguely intrusive. I walked over anyway. I don't know what I was going to say. I hadn't figured that out before my feet started moving. But I got to about 4 feet from him, and the daughter looked at me with the wariness that women develop for approaching strangers, and I said, stupidly, "Excuse me, did that guard know you?" She opened her mouth. The old man answered first. "No," he said. His voice was firm. No wavering. The voice of a person who had spent decades in environments where voice control was not optional. "He didn't know me," he said. "He just knew. His name was Raymond. He told me this like it was a slightly unnecessary detail, the name his mother had given him, not the thing he was, not the information that mattered. He said it the way men of that generation sometimes say things, economically, as if words cost something, and he'd been careful with his budget his whole life. His daughter's name was Patricia. She had her father's eyes and a slightly apologetic quality that I came to understand, over the next 20 minutes, was the residue of years spent translating him to the rest of the world. "He doesn't usually come to these things," she said. It was her idea, Raymond said, meaning Patricia, who looked like she'd heard this attribution before and accepted it with patient inaccuracy. "It was your idea," she said calmly. "I just drove." He almost smiled. We were off to the side of the main pavement, near one of the stone blocks that function as anti-vehicle barriers, which Raymond was leaning against, not because he needed to, I suspected, but because it was there and offering didn't cost anything. A few of the other lingering crowd members had drifted closer. Not intruding. Just close. The Philadelphia woman was definitely listening. I decided not to mind. I asked him how long ago he'd served. He thought about it. Not because he didn't know, but because he was choosing how much to give. "I was with the Grenadiers," he said finally. "In another life. The Grenadier Guards. The regiment whose members were, right now, on the other side of those gates." Patricia caught my expression. 50 years, she said softly. "More." I did the maths. 50 years back from now would put his service in the early 70s. Which meant, depending on his age, and he looked mid-80s now, he could have been serving in the last years of British operations in Aden. Or the early stages of the Northern Ireland Troubles. I didn't ask. Some maths you do in your head and, then, quietly put away. "You served with men who would have trained the men in there," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "Not trained," he said. "Passed something on. There's a difference." I waited. "Training you can give in a classroom," he said. "What you pass on in a regiment that lives in the institution. The men change. The uniform stays. The thing inside the uniform, the thing that makes it more than costume, that passes from man to man without anybody writing it down." He looked back at the gate. "That boy in there today. He doesn't know me from Adam." But he saw this, he touched the peak of his cap with one finger, a ghost of the salute, and he knew what it meant. What it cost. Where it came from. He paused. "The regiment knew," he said. "That's enough." Patricia told me the rest, later, when Raymond had excused himself to find a bench and she and I stood near the barrier together in the slowly warming morning. He had not been back to the palace in over 30 years. Not for any dramatic reason, no falling out, no grievance. Life. The way life fills up the spaces where you meant to go back. His wife, Margaret, had always wanted to bring him. Thought it would be good for him, the way that the people who love veterans sometimes think that exposure to the formal symbols of their service will help them integrate something that has never quite integrated. He'd resisted it for reasons he didn't explain, and she, being Margaret apparently, had not pushed. Margaret had died in March. 8 months ago. He's been very, Patricia paused, selecting the word with her father's economy, contained. Since then. He holds everything very close and doesn't let it move. She looked over at the bench where Raymond sat, perfectly upright, looking at nothing in particular with his old soldier's composure. He's been contained his whole life, she added, with a gentleness that wasn't criticism. It's how he survived. You become what keeps you alive, don't you? I thought about that. Coming today was his idea, she said. He said it out of nowhere, 3 days ago. Just, I'd like to go down to the palace. Like it was a completely normal thing to decide. I nearly fell off my chair. She smiled, but, just briefly. I don't know, I can't know, but, I think he came because he wanted to feel part of something that still existed. After Margaret. When you lose the person who was the whole architecture of your daily life, you need something to locate yourself inside of. Something that was there before you and will be there after. She looked at the gate. He needed to know the regiment was still there. That the thing he gave his young life to hadn't gone anywhere. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. And then, that guard, she stopped. Collected herself. He couldn't have known. How would he know? But, he looked at my father, just for a moment, that half second, and, my father straightened. He just straightened, like something clicked back into position inside him. And, then, he saluted and, she pressed her lips together. I haven't seen him hold his head up like that in 8 months. Here's the part that I didn't understand until later. The rule that guard broke or bent, or applied with a latitude that the rulebook wouldn't quite endorse is not a small rule. The requirement for eyes forward during ceremonial duty is fundamental. It exists because the alternative is chaos. A guard who makes eye contact invites interaction, and interaction is exactly what ceremonial discipline is designed to prevent. There are videos online of guards shouting formal warnings at tourists who step into their march path. Videos of them stamping, at full volume, to scatter people blocking their route. That's the sanctioned deviation from form, the scripted exception for when the public creates a safety or operational hazard. Looking at an old man in the crowd? Holding his gaze for 3 seconds? That's not in the script. I know, because I eventually spoke to someone, a former NCO, not involved in that day's duty, not connected to the regiment in any current way, who explained to me what those 3 seconds would have cost that soldier if someone in his chain of command had caught it and decided to pursue it. Nothing catastrophic, the NCO said. It's not career-ending. But, it's a formal note. It goes in a record. For a junior soldier who's proud of his ceremonial standards, who takes that posting seriously, which they all do, because they're guardsmen, they can't help it, that's not nothing. He thought about it. But, here's the thing, he said. Any officer who saw that and chose to write it up would have had to ask himself one question first. Whether the thing the soldier did, in that moment, was actually a violation of what the ceremony is for or the most precise expression of it. He was quiet for a moment. The ceremony exists to honor the institution and what it represents. That old man in the coat, that cap badge, that salute, that man is what the ceremony is for. Not the tourists with their cameras. Not the civic ritual for its own sake. That man. He looked at me. Some officers would still write it up. Rules are rules and they don't bend for sentiment. But some, the ones who understand what a regiment actually is, would look the other way and feel something about the young soldier who did it. I went back to Raymond after Patricia and I had finished talking. He was on the bench where she'd pointed, still upright, one hand resting on each knee. I sat down next to him, which was presumptuous of me, and I knew it. He didn't seem to mind. We sat there for a minute without talking. The tourist traffic was flowing normally now. The gates were closed, the boxes empty, the ceremony completely over. Just a Tuesday. Just a cold morning. Can I ask you something? I said. He waited. Listening without confirming. When you saluted him, what was that for? He didn't answer immediately. He had a particular way of considering questions that reminded me of people I'd met who'd done certain kinds of work in their lives, the pause that comes not from not knowing what to say, but from deciding how precisely to say it. The ceremony is a conversation, he said finally. Between the living regiment and everyone who came before. It's been happening every day, almost every day, for 300 years. New men, same conversation. He glanced at me. When I stood there this morning in this coat with this badge, I was part of that conversation. The regiment was speaking to me through those boys. And, when that lad looked at me, he stopped. He was telling me, we're still here. The thing you gave part of yourself to is still here. And, I was telling him, I see you. I know what it costs. The thing you're carrying, I carried it too. He looked at his hands. Margaret would have said that was the most I've explained anything in 40 years of marriage. It might have been a joke. I couldn't tell, and I got the sense that was deliberate. She would have been right, he added, quieter. He stood up from the bench with the careful precision of a man who has learned to trust no movement to chance. Straightened his coat. Put both buttons in order. Thank you for the conversation, he said. Not dismissive, sincere. The thanks of a man who means it precisely. And, he walked back toward Patricia, who was waiting at the corner with his hand already in the air for a cab. I missed the morning conference session. Not entirely accidentally. I stood on that pavement for a while after Raymond's cab pulled away, holding my completely cold coffee and not really going anywhere. The crowd had thinned. The pigeons were back to doing whatever pigeons do when the spectacle ends. A city bus went past. Someone was arguing with a parking machine. London was just London again. I should explain something about myself, because it matters for why this particular morning burrowed into me the way it did and has refused to leave. I have never served. I have no military family. My understanding of what a regiment means, the specific gravity of the word, the way soldiers of Raymond's generation use it like a living thing rather than an administrative category, is theoretical. Academic. The understanding of someone who has read about something rather than inhabited it. I came from a family of academics and teachers. My father was a mild-mannered historian who spent his career arguing, very politely, in journal articles, about the interpretation of medieval land records. The closest he ever came to military ceremony was taking me to see the changing of the guard when I was 12 and explaining, in his careful way, the Napoleonic-era roots of the bearskin cap. I had never saluted anything in my life. And, standing there on that pavement, watching the cab carrying Raymond disappear into the traffic, I felt something I did not have a name for. Something in the vicinity of grief, but not quite. Something adjacent to gratitude, but not that either. Something that had to do with time. With the unbearable ordinary passage of it. With the fact that men like Raymond, men who carry whole eras in their bodies, who marched in formations that no longer exist in exactly the way they did, who have buried colleagues and wives and pieces of themselves and come out the other side still in a polished coat with straight buttons, exist only for a fixed and finite period, and then they don't. And, most of the time, nobody notices. The Philadelphia woman found me before I left. She'd been waiting, slightly to the side, with the patience of someone who has something to say and is willing to give the moment its full duration before saying it. Her name was Carol. She was in London with her sister, doing what she called a bucket list trip, 10 days, the museums, the theater, the walking tours. Her husband had died 2 years before. Heart. She said this matter-of-factly, not to generate sympathy, but, the way widows sometimes do, inserting it as a fact of the landscape. Here is who I am now. This is the geography. Her husband, she said, had been a Vietnam veteran. She said that word veteran with a particular weight, which is not universal. In America, Vietnam veteran carries a charge that other service eras don't, or don't in the same way. A whole freight of what was done to those men. Not in the war, necessarily. In the coming home. He never felt, she stopped. Started again. He never felt like his service meant something to anyone outside of the men he served with. His whole life. He died not feeling that. She was looking at the gate. And, that old man today, her voice broke once, cleanly, then, came back, that soldier looked at him and, he stood up straight. And, I thought, I hope someone, somewhere, sometime, looked at my Robert like that. I hope he had one moment when somebody in a uniform looked at him and said, I see you. I know what you are. She pressed her fingers to her eyes briefly. Sorry, she said. Don't, I said. She nodded. Collected herself with the briskness of a woman who has cried in public enough times to have developed an exit strategy. Bucket list, she said, slightly rueful. I didn't put "cry outside Buckingham Palace" on it, but here we are. I laughed. She laughed too. We stood there for another moment. The boy in the uniform, she said, thoughtfully. He has no idea what he did this morning. Does he? I thought about that. Maybe he does, I said. Maybe that's exactly why he did it. I want to talk about the guard, because I haven't, not really. He has existed in this account as a figure, a function, the young soldier who broke or bent the rule. The catalyst. He hasn't existed as a person. I don't know his name. I didn't see his face clearly enough, from my angle, to describe it beyond young, square jaw, the particular expression of effort as effortlessness that ceremonial duty seems to imprint on the faces of the soldiers performing it. He was somewhere in his mid-20s, maybe younger. He marched well. He had the bearing. He had, clearly, the instinct. Because what he did, that eye contact, that held gaze, those 3 counted seconds, was not a scripted response. It was not something he'd been told to do. The rules, if anything, had been told to him in the opposite direction. And he did it anyway. I keep coming back to what the former NCO said to me. About how some officers would look the other way because they'd understand. About the question of whether what the guard did was a violation of what the ceremony is for or the most precise expression of it. I think the answer is clear, but I also think the guard didn't pause to ask the question. He saw an old man in a Grenadier Guards cap badge. He knew what that cap badge meant. He knew, in the way that institutions transmit knowledge that is never written down, that passes between generations like something carried in the blood of the organization, he knew what it cost to wear that badge. What that man had given and, carried and, survived. And, in the middle of a ceremony that is, at its core, about exactly that, about honoring the institution and everyone who built it, he chose to acknowledge the living evidence of it standing 20 feet away. Rules are not the institution. Rules serve the institution. He understood the difference. That's not something you can teach in training. There is a particular thing that happens, sometimes, when people witness something they weren't expecting to feel. They look for permission. The Philadelphia woman, Carol, she'd started to cry before she knew anyone around her had noticed. And then, she'd looked at the people near her, and the people near her were all wearing the same expression she was wearing, and something in that collective recognition gave the emotion somewhere to go. Like the crowd became a container for something that was too large for one person to hold alone. I watched it happen. The teenagers, the boy with the hoodie and his friend, were quiet in the aftermath in a way that was different from bored quiet. This was the quiet of people who have seen something they don't have a category for yet. Something that arrived before the vocabulary for it did. The boy with the hoodie said something to his friend, low and, in whatever language they were using between themselves, and his friend nodded. I'm not a reader of lips. But I know what certain postures mean. That nod was, yeah. I don't know either. But, yeah. The Japanese couple, they hadn't stopped photographing, I noticed, but they'd shifted what they were photographing. During the ceremony, they'd photographed the guards, the gates, the formations. After I watched this happen, they photographed Raymond. From a respectful distance. His back, primarily, the navy coat, the cap. The straight spine. Patricia beside him. Not as a tourist spectacle. There was a quality of intention in the way the woman raised the camera that was different from how she'd photographed the pigeon. She was trying to keep it. I ended up not going back to the conference at all that day. I walked instead. Through St. James's Park, across the bridge with the view that you might think was too perfect to be real, up through the quiet end of Westminster. I walked and I thought about Raymond telling me, the thing you pass on lives in the institution. It passes from man to man without anybody writing it down. I thought about Margaret, 8 months gone. About how a person can be the whole architecture of someone else's daily life. About the particular loneliness of the very old in a world that moves too quickly to consistently make room for what they carry. About how Raymond had come that morning not because he needed the ceremony but because the ceremony needed him. Because a tradition that exists to honor what he was is only fully itself when he stands in front of it. The viewer and the viewed. The past and its own continuity. And about how one young soldier, with a 3-second deviation from a rule that exists for very good reasons, had given that to him. I've told this story a number of times since that Tuesday. The reactions are interesting. Almost everyone, when they hear the part about the guard holding the gaze, feels something. The specifics of who feels what vary. Some people go straight to Raymond, some to Patricia's description of her father straightening his spine, some to Carol's grief for her husband Robert. But almost everyone goes somewhere. The people who don't are the people who get stuck on the rule. He shouldn't have done that, one of my colleagues said, when I told him. Not unkindly. Just matter of fact. He's a precise person, my colleague. He values systems. If every soldier starts making individual judgments about when the rules apply, you don't have a ceremony anymore. You have actors improvising. He's not wrong. The counterargument he's making is real and serious. But I keep thinking about what Raymond said. The ceremony is a conversation between the living regiment and everyone who came before. If that conversation only runs one way, the institution performing for the public observing passively, the veterans in the crowd invisible behind the fact of their ordinariness, then, what is it actually saying? Raymond that morning was not a tourist. He was not a member of the public in the civilian sense. He was the thing the ceremony exists to honor, standing in the crowd, unannounced, unscheduled, holding his cap badge and his grief and his lifetime of given service, and waiting to see if anyone would see him. And one person did. One young grenadier, in a bearskin hat, with the long straight stare, found him in a crowd of 200 and said, "I see you." That's not improvisation. That's the ceremony working exactly the way it's supposed to. There's one more thing. About 2 months after that Tuesday, I received an email. I'd given Patricia my card, a reflex, something I do without thinking, and she'd apparently held onto it. The email was short. She wrote the way her father spoke, economically. Carefully. She said Raymond had been doing better. Not a word she used lightly, she clarified, not better as in recovered or healed or any of the therapist language she'd been surrounding herself with since Margaret. Better as in, more present. More willing to eat properly and ring people back and, twice, come to Sunday lunch with the grandchildren without needing 3 days prior notice to prepare for the noise. She said he'd told the story of that morning to her daughter, his granddaughter, 18 years old, in her first year at university, and apparently had done so with a specificity that she, Patricia, had never heard from him. The cap badge. The formation. The weight of the salute. The guard's eyes. She said her daughter had cried, which Raymond had seemed both surprised by and quietly gratified by. She said he kept the photograph. The one the Japanese woman had taken, because it turns out the couple had found them afterward, the way some thoughtful people do, and emailed a copy of the photograph through to Patricia, having somehow obtained her contact details in the way that determined strangers sometimes do. It was a photograph of his back. The navy coat. The cap. The straight spine. Patricia beside him, her hand finally at his elbow. He kept it framed on the mantelpiece, next to Margaret's photograph. She said, "I thought you'd want to know." She said, he called it the best morning he'd had in years. She said, he says the regiment is still there. I think about that guard sometimes. That young soldier, back in his box, back in the monument version of himself, in the days after that Tuesday. Whether his officer said anything. Whether he logged it internally as a deviation or as something else. Whether, when he lies awake in the particular 3 a.m. of people who have done things in their lives that require processing, he ever thinks about that 3-second look at a man in a navy coat. I hope he knows. I hope somehow, in the closed loop of information that passes through institutions, in the wordless thing that travels man to man without being written down, I hope somehow he knows what those 3 seconds gave. An old soldier, still capable of standing straight. A woman crying for her husband, finding somewhere to put it. 100 strangers on a cold Tuesday morning, all briefly located inside something larger than themselves. The regiment, still there. Still there.